Hi, it's Phil here from Revive My Ride, and in this video I'm going to show you how to do the Mercedes auto transmission service on the 7G Tronic gearbox, also known as the 722.9 transmission. And this will be a full Mercedes auto transmission service, so it'll include the internal filter change as well as the transmission oil change. If you plan on draining the torque converter as part of the transmission service, and it's a good idea to do that if you're able to, and I'll explain more about that later, then you'll want to put the car into neutral before you even start because it becomes more awkward later. Once you're sure you've got the car in the position where you want to work on it, then with the engine running, go ahead and shift the transmission into neutral. And once you've done that, you can just go ahead and turn the engine off. But what you'll find is with the transmission in neutral and the engine turned off, it won't want to release the key. So you're just going to have to leave it there for the duration of the work. So the first step is draining the old auto transmission fluid. So let's get that started, and then I'll show you very quickly the service parts you're going to need. You'll just need a 6mm hex or an Allen key to undo this. And then we can just start the fluid draining out, which is good. As you can see, not much transmission fluid came out, and that's because Mercedes use an overflow pipe. And so what you need to do is reach in with a screwdriver and knock over that overflow pipe. So you just need to reach in like that and then just move the screwdriver to one side. Okay, so while that's draining, here's the service parts you're going to need. The first one is, we know we've dropped the sump plug, and of course it has a little copper washer on it. So this is the replacement sump plug washer. The second one is, we know we're going to drop the pan in order to fit a new internal filter. So here's the new internal filter. When we drop the pan, we're going to undo all the bolts. So here's 6 new bolts, and so this is a new seal for the pan. And then finally, the most important thing for a Mercedes transmission fluid change is the fluid. And as you can see, this is MB approved 236.14. Only use oil that has that on the front, and I'll provide a link to a list of oils in the description, and of course all of the part numbers as well that you might need. One final thing to say is, this is red fluid. And red fluid is used on the early 722.9 7G Tronic transmissions, and then after that they changed to a blue fluid. So the easiest way to tell in advance whether you need the blue or the red transmission fluid, the red fluid cars will have these round dimples, so 4 round dimples that are quite small. And the later 2010 cars that take blue fluid, those dimples will be oval in shape and a little bit larger. And you'll get further confirmation when you drop the pan, because the overflow pipe on the early cars will either be white or black, and then on the later cars with the blue fluid, it'll be green. Now that the transmission fluid has stopped draining, it's time to drop the pan. And before we undo the bolts to it, on a lot of cars there's actually a little heat shield here near the exhaust, and that makes it really awkward to drop the pan, so I'm going to drop that off first, and you need a T30 Torx bit for that. And now you can just slide this heat shield down. It has a little clip at the top that it goes behind. Really hard to show on camera, but you'll see it. But you can just slide it towards you and then just kind of leave it dangling there now. Okay, and then the pan itself has 6 bolts in total, and they're 5mm hex. So you can use an Allen key or a 5mm hex tool. And you'll probably notice that each one of the bolts has this little clip on it which grips the side of the pan. And the bolt from the front right, where we just did the heat shield, is a slightly different clip. So what I tend to do is I leave one bolt in the back corner, and I place my bucket near the front corner, and then I literally just tilt that pan down a little bit and just catch any extra. So this here is the internal filter, and it has a little port at the front, and it just push fit. So if you just wiggle it and pull down, then it'll slide off. And sometimes you get just a little bit more oil, so it's worth having the bucket there. Okay, so we've got the oil pan on the bench. Just a few things to note really. The first is we have a white overflow pipe. Remember I said that white and black are the early cars with the red fluid, green is for the later cars with the blue fluid. The second thing is these are magnets here, and they actually just come off, but it's worth taking note where they are because you'll want to put them back there. And they're a good indication of the health of your transmission, because the purpose of these magnets are to pick up any metal fragments and stop it circulating around your automatic transmission. So it's worth cleaning those. So I'm just using a clean rag. So mine's got 2 of them. And then we know we have a new seal or gasket for the pan. So we might as well take this one off and discard it. And the final thing is using a clean rag. It's worth giving this a really good wipe and clean out, including all of the edges where we know we're going to be fitting the new gasket in a minute. So just putting the magnets back. And now we'll put this new gasket on, ready for refitting the pan. So that's about 4 to 5 litres of gearbox oil drained from the transmission. And now it's time to drain the torque converter if we can. Why did I say if we can? Well, the answer is that not all Mercedes 722.9 transmissions have a drain plug on the torque converter. Or if they do have one, it's not accessible through a little port for draining and servicing. In general, the early cars didn't have access to the torque converter plug, and so you can only do a transmission fluid change on what you've already got out of the pan. But the rule of thumb is if your Mercedes automatic transmission has this type of access port, then you can drain it, and if not, then you probably can't. And so you can see access is a little bit restricted, but this one here should just pull off, and then that gives a little bit better access. And then the cover itself, it's just a flexible rubber, so you can just kind of grab it. Well, you can when it's not really oily. And then that dome shape that you can see in there is the torque converter, and somewhere on it there's a drain plug. And so this is where it gets interesting, because if you can't see it, and chances are you won't be able to, then you need to rotate that round until you can see it. And so in order to bring the drain plug round, then you have to turn the engine over on the crank. And it's easiest to do it from underneath if you take the under tray that's off from underneath the engine. And so these are 8mm bolts. And so now, standing at the front of the car and with the engine under tray off, you can see the cross member there and the radiators just in front of it, and above it is the crankshaft bolt. And then we can reach in with a 27mm socket on a ratchet or a strong bar. And what I'm going to do now is just keep turning the crank clockwise whilst watching the torque converter to see when the drain plug comes round. Okay, so hopefully you can see it alright. The crank's actually quite easy to turn with the transmission in neutral. So I don't always remove this bit of under tray here, but for the purposes of filming and access, I'm going to drop this down, and it's just 2 more of those 8mm bolts that I mentioned. And holding the trim up with your head is a valid technique, and it actually says it in the Mercedes instruction manual. And to undo that plug, you'll need quite a long 4mm Allen key, and preferably without a ball on the end, because this plug's quite tight, and ball type Allen keys, sometimes the ball snaps off. So it might not look like there's much fluid in there, but there actually is. And the thing is, it's running quite slow because there's no way of air getting into that torque converter, so it's kind of glugging a bit. So I've got a nice semi-transparent bucket here, obviously starting at 10 litres at the top and going down to 4. So let's see how much I managed to get out of there. And as you can see, we got about 7 litres in total out of the transmission pan and the torque converter. I've got a new torque converter drain plug here, and it comes with a new copper washer on it, and also it comes with some Loctite on the thread already. The only thing to say is this is an 8mm torque converter plug, which I measured with the vernier calipers, and that means that it's 10 Newton meters tightening torque. On some versions of the 722.9 transmission, they moved it to a 10mm plug. It's worth measuring it, and if you've got a 10mm plug, one, it'll probably need a different Allen key to unfasten it, but it also means that you'll need 15 Newton meters of tightening torque when you put it back in again. That's just in there finger tight at the moment. That's got it. So I just have that little cover to put back in place, and it just pushes in. Now we can turn our attention to the transmission pan, and all I'm going to do is clean up all of those areas. And that'll make the new pan seal seat better, because without any oil on there, it'll be less likely to slip out of position. This bracket back here obscures your view of the back of the pan, so I actually prefer to drop this down out of the way. It just makes getting the pan back up on there easier. And also it makes it so that you can inspect the seal at the back to make sure it's in position okay. So if you do decide to drop this bracket off, then it's a 13mm socket for these two. And then on this left hand side here, all you have to do is loosen those, you don't have to take them off completely. So the Mercedes auto transmission internal filter is just a push fit back into the bottom of the transmission. And all I'm going to do is put a little bit of fresh oil just on the O-ring, and that'll just make it push up into position more easily. And then all you have to do is spot the port where it pushes up into, and then you just line it up and push it on. And don't worry that it's at a little bit of an angle, that's pretty much how they sit. So now we're ready to lift the transmission pan back in place, and I've got two of my new bolts ready, and I've transferred the clips from the old bolts to grip the edge of the pan. And all I'm going to do now is lift the pan up nice and straight and square, and then I've just got one bolt here with the clip on, and this is the middle one at the far side that I'm putting in. And now I'm just going to put the other one finger tight middle at the near side. And now that it's held in place, it's really easy for me just to go around with the other bolts and clips and put them all in finger tight. So I'm sure you remember from earlier that we undid this heat shield. And so the reason why there's a special clip on this front right is because there's a little threaded hole for the heat shield to fasten to. And we'll come back and we'll bolt that on later once we've torqued the pan up properly. Just a quick word about the transmission pan bolts. So this is the new aluminium one that I purchased, and you can see it has a Torx fitting at one end. Well, I've done this job quite a few times, and I always find, even if I buy new bolts and at a very low torque of 8 Newton meters, I get some of these breaking. And so what you'll probably see is that I've swapped some of them out for cap head steel ones. That's down to personal choice really, and you'll have to see how you get on. The correct one's definitely the aluminium ones. If you're stuck in having a lot of problems, it's your choice, but you could swap to a steel one. So now I've got my mini torque wrench, which is set to 8 Newton meters, and I'm just going to go front right to back left, and then back right to front left, and then the middle one and the middle one. So that hopefully will fasten that pan up evenly. So let's get the first one. Okay, back left, back right, front left, and then the two middle ones. And now with that done, we can come back to the little Torx bolt that holds the heat shield in place just there. And this one doesn't have to be torqued, but since we've got our torque wrench here, an 8 Newton meter seems to be about right for this size of bolt. Might as well do that, huh? And then these two bolts that we took out not long ago at the back of the pan, we can just pop those back in now. And then just tighten up these two nuts where the bracket holds onto the exhaust. So now we've gotten to the trickiest part of any Mercedes-Benz transmission oil change, which is getting the fluid back up into the gearbox. But it's not too bad once you know what tools are required and what the technique is, so let's show you how. And the first thing you're going to need is an adapter to go into where the sump plug came out, and that's because you fill up a Mercedes transmission from the bottom, and you remember that white overflow pipe, or it might have been green or another colour on yours, that's in the bottom of the pan, where the fluid goes up that overflow pipe and then into the pan. And because it can't come back to the top of the overflow pipe, then it just stays in there. So that means you can come along and you can either pump in or you can inject in the fluid in stages. So now I'm going to flash up on the screen the kit that I use, so you can see that there's an adapter at one end that goes into the pan, and then what you could use is a few lengths of hose, a valve, and then eventually a hand pump or some other method to put it up into the transmission pan. And I know in the States a lot of people use a little pump that they pick up from Harbor Freight, so obviously that's another method. So all I need to do is screw the adapter, and the thread on it is M12 by 1.5. And you can get various adapters either to go to a different screw thread or to go to a hose tail so you can put a hose on. And then of course you can see I have a valve there which I'll leave closed for now. And then I've got my hand pump here. So here I've got my Mercedes transmission fluid which we talked about earlier. I'm just going to put it into this jug, and this jug holds just over half a litre. And all I'm going to do is draw the fluid up into my hand pump, like so. And as you can see, I got quite a lot of it just in one go. And then I'll put it onto the bottom of my adapter there, and then go ahead and pump that up into the transmission. And then just keep repeating the process. Open the valve, and then go ahead and pump that up into the transmission. And once I've got that up in there, just shut the valve again. As a DIYer where you're only going to do this job every now and then, I think the process is okay. But a pump would be faster if you're wanting to save yourself some minutes. So that's the 5 litres of the gearbox oil added up into the gearbox. And what we need to do now is jump up into the car and start it up. And that will prime the torque converter. So when we come back underneath, we'll be able to top up the transmission with some more fluid. Okay, so we're back in the car and it's time to start it up so that we can prime the transmission. And if you had the car in neutral earlier so that you could turn the engine and bring the torque converter drain screw round, then now you'll have to put it into park so that you can start it up. So it's just a case of pushing the gear selector up into park just like that. And now of course it's foot on the brake, and then we can turn the key to get it started up. Now we just let it stay in park for about 10 seconds. And then we'll start to step down through each of the selections on the gear change. So of course the first one is reverse. Remember to keep your foot on the brake though, especially if you're on a ramp like I am. And you could hear the engine tone change a little bit then as it went into reverse gear. So we just need about 10 seconds of that. And then we're going to step it to the next one, which is just neutral. Probably less important, this one. And now finally we're going to go into drive. And again the car moved just a little bit, which showed the gearbox was engaging. And I'll speed this bit up now, because what I do is I'll work my way back up the box again and then down a couple of times, you know, probably being a little bit more thorough than I need to be. So let's leave it in park and running, and then we'll jump out and I'll show you how to do that fluid top up. Okay, so here's a good rule of thumb for you. So we're going to do the level top up now, and what you want to do is put half a litre more into the transmission than what you took out. So for example, if you had the type of transmission where you only drained the pan, not the torque converter, you probably got about 5 litres out. Now I put 5 litres in a minute ago, so at this point you guys would just top up with another half a litre, and then you can go through the level check process once you're up to temperature. But for those of you that drained the torque converter, you probably took about 6.5 litres out, which is what I did. And so now I've already got 5 in, I'm going to put another 2 in, so half a litre more than what I took out. And I'm going to put my additional 2 litres in now. Okay, so here's a little extra tip for you. If you're unsure how much transmission fluid to put in on this topping up stage, basically what you want to do is slightly overfill the transmission, because later when we do the level check, you actually just drain off the excess. That's how it works. So what you can do is you can keep adding, for example, half a litre of fluid and then opening up the valve. And if you only get a tiny bit, just enough that would be in the overflow pipe out, which would be less than 50 mil, then you know you still need to add more. But if you open the valve and it just keeps coming, say you get 250 mil out, then that shows it was above the overflow pipe, so above the fill level that you're trying to achieve. I'll show you how to do it. So let's give that a try. Now you see how I just got a tiny bit then and then it stopped. So that's about 50 mil. That means there wasn't enough fluid in there. I was expecting it just to keep coming until we got to about there, about 1/4 litre. So let's try again. I just put another half litre up into the transmission. So let's see how much drains back now. Okay, so can you see what I mean? There's quite a lot coming back. So that's good. It means that the transmission is slightly over full, because the final stage in a Mercedes auto transmission fluid change is to get it up to temperature and then just drain off the excess, and then that'll make sure that it's at the right level for normal driving. If you have access to Star Diagnostics, then you can just plug straight into the ECU and you can monitor the transmission fluid level at that point. But the way I do it as a normal DIYer is just using an infrared thermometer. This one's made by Aventec, not affiliated with them, but I'll put a link in the description below. But it's cost effective and I've used it quite a few times and found it to work well. And all I have to do is aim this at the bottom of the transmission pan, and that's because as the fluid gets hot, obviously it's sitting in the pan, and it'll very quickly transfer that heat through the bottom of the metal pan. And as you can see, I'm on almost 40, well, I'm on 41 degrees, and I'm trying to get to 45. So just a few more minutes of running. Just a thing to say about the infrared thermometer is it works best when you're at a right angle to the surface that you're measuring. If you go to quite an acute angle, then the beam bounces away a little bit and you get a lower reading. And you can see I've got to 45 degrees there, and I don't want it to go too much over temperature because I want to make sure that I do my level check correct. So time to get on with it. Now we're ready for the final act, which is draining off a little bit of the fluid until it comes down to the correct level. So all I'm going to do is open this valve and drain it into the jug. Can you see how it's starting to splutter now? That's the correct amount. You don't have to wait until it stops dripping entirely. I'm just going to pop the sump plug in, and I've got a new copper seal or copper washer for the sump plug. And it's easiest doing it now while the engine's still running, because you'll lose less fluid when you unscrew your adapter off of the sump, because the engine and transmission running is keeping the level lower in the sump, you see. Just be careful though, because the fluid will be hot now. And that's just hand tight at the moment, because I'll come back with a torque wrench in just a minute. The torque setting for the transmission sump plug is 22 Newton meters, so I just have my little torque wrench here, and that's it. Okay, so I've just got the engine under tray to get back on, but you guys took it off not long ago, so I'm sure you know how to get that back on there, so we'll leave it at that. But if you've got any questions or comments, just pop them below and I'll try to help you if I can. And if you want to see more content just like this, then please consider subscribing, and I'll catch you in the next video. Okay, thanks for watching. Bye for now.